Hello, AP Psych. Welcome back to the Underground. I hope you're all doing well and staying healthy. Um, for today's lesson, we are going to talk about Module 61, which is all about assessing intelligence. And to follow along in your book, just turn to page 632. That'll be our starting point. We're going to talk about two different things today. The first is the problematic history of intelligence testing. And then the second one will be a bunch of terms just that we use to understand intelligence tests and interpret them, the terminology that we tend to find very frequently in free response to type questions, the research type questions. If they're going to give us a question on this unit in the scientific section, the section that's rooted in understanding data, they're probably going to pull charts and graphs on intelligence tests and things like that. So we need to be prepared for that. So first, what is an intelligence test? Well, intelligence tests assess an individual's mental aptitude and compare it with other people's using numerical scores. Frequently, we call this numerical score an intelligence quotient. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but not all intelligence scores use the term intelligence quotient, but they all give you some sort of number that you can use to assess your intelligence against other people's intelligence. There are two different types of intelligence tests. The first one is an achievement test. Achievement tests test what you already know. The ACT or the SAT would be great examples of achievement tests. The AP Psych test is an achievement test. These basically just try to show what kind of skills you already have, what knowledge you already have. The other kind would be an aptitude test, and an aptitude test tries to predict your performance on future tasks. So the idea with an aptitude test would be, let's say it shows that you have a high IQ, then they would expect that you would be able to read at an effective level, that you'd be able to reason at an effective level, all of that kind of stuff. Now, there's some debate here. Howard Gardner calls the ACT a thinly veiled intelligence test. It's kind of a funny concept. But we do find that there is a 0.81 positive correlation between the ACT and general intelligence scores. Is the purpose of the ACT to predict how well we're going to do in college, or is it to assess what skills we've already developed? There's some debate over whether it's an achievement score or an aptitude score, right? That we may be trying to sneak it in as an aptitude. The most significant name in early intelligence testing is Alfred Binet. And in the late 1800s, the French government hired Alfred Binet and also his assistant Théodore Simon to identify struggling students, to look at all these elementary aged students and figure out how can we get them the best educations that they can get. So part of the goal here that Binet had was to try to figure out how he could work towards social justice. How could he make it so that struggling kids would get the assistance that they needed and advanced kids wouldn't have to waste their time with stuff they already knew? How could they be appropriately challenged in the classroom? So what Binet and Simon did was create the Binet-Simon test, the Binet-Simon test, as we normally call it. And the goal here was to assess a student's mental age. And the way you find out a mental age is you take the student's actual age and then you figure out what level of work is he doing. So let's say you have a 10-year-old kid. If that 10-year-old kid is working at the appropriate grade level for 10-year-olds, which we would call fourth grade, then that kid has a mental age of 10. But if the kid can't handle fourth grade work, let's say he can only handle the work of second graders, then he would have the biological age of 10, but he would have the mental age of 8. And let's say he could do advanced work. Let's say that he could do the work of sixth graders. Then what would be his mental age? Good job. Okay. So, Binet and Simon did not believe that intelligence was fixed. They believed that a lot of our intelligence has to do with our upbringings. So if we are given lots of resources as children, lots of stimulation, that basically we will develop more quickly. And if we don't have enough to eat, if we don't have a safe home environment, if we aren't exposed to lots of stimulating cultural materials and all that kind of stuff, if no one teaches us how to read, then we're going to end up being intellectually delayed, but not necessarily impaired, right? So the whole quest Binet had was to make it so that schools could identify where children are appropriate to their age levels and then help them get a boost if they needed that boost and help them get the extra challenge if they are already ahead of the scale. He was testing for G. He believed like his test is based largely in linguistic skills and problem solving and matching of shapes and things like that, finding similarities between things. And his test is very popular. And then we run into a little problem, and this is when the test is brought to America. A psychologist at Stanford named Louis Terman took Binet's work and he tried to apply it to American schools. And as he applied it to American schools, he did two things that I think Binet would have had a huge problem with. The first is that when he developed the Stanford Binet test, which is called the Stanford Binet test because it was developed using Binet's ideas while Terman was at Stanford, right? The Stanford Binet test, which is the most one of the most popular and widely used child psychology tests of all time. So one of the most important intelligence tests. You can still take it today. But one of the things that he did was he dismissed the idea of mental age. Or I shouldn't say he dismissed it, he modified it. He was a big fan of this German psychologist named William Stern, who basically had this concept of an intelligence quotient. And the way you arrive at an intelligence quotient, originally speaking, was that you take the mental age, right? So let's say I have a 10-year-old kid and he's achieving at the level of a 10-year-old. Then you divide 10 by 10 and you multiply that by 100 and you get 100. And 100 in an IQ test means that you have an average intelligence, that you're working at appropriate grade level, right? Let's say you you have a mental age of 8 and you're 10 years old. Then you would divide 8 by 10 and multiply that by 100 and you'd have an IQ of 80. So let's say if you were 10 years old and you were doing the work of a 12-year-old, what would your IQ then be? Exactly right. Now, as Terman was doing this, he started labeling the kids according to their abilities. So let's say I were to score a 120 or higher. I would be called very superior. That's nice. Let's say I were to score a 55. Terman would label me a moron. I've been called worse, but look at how the language is used to classify, not help. The second thing that Terman did here that was really dangerous and that Binet absolutely would have hated is this idea that he bought into the early 20th century concept that intelligence is inherited. Binet did not. Binet thought it was developed, that it was a flexible sort of number that G could change over time. But Terman had ties to the eugenics community. There was this big popular movement in the 1920s in Europe and in America that basically said that Darwinism is the guiding force behind human behavior. This concept of social Darwinism, where society needs to reward the powerful, the intelligent, and the athletic. And it needs to try to weed everybody else out of the gene pool for the good of humanity. You might recognize these theories from people like Adolf Hitler, Henry Ford, a lot of Margaret Sanger, a lot of people who just are who had very racist and xenophobic ideas about people. One of the things that you find from a lot of intelligence tests from the era were that they tended to reward you for being wealthy, privileged, and white, and they tended to discriminate against you for not being those things, or particularly for being an immigrant. If you didn't have the same sort of access to power and security in American history, you tended to do badly on the tests, and then people would say, "Oh, look, they didn't pass the test that we used, so they must be they must be dumb. These people are a challenge to America's prosperity." So Terman did not think of the Stanford-Binet test as being a tool for helping teachers bring students up to the proper developmental levels. He used it as a way of defining people's intellect for the rest of their school careers. My own personal history, I took the Stanford-Binet test to get into kindergarten over at Detroit Country Day. And when you take the test as a kindergartner, a lot of what you do is you cover up the picture that doesn't belong, and someone looks at, proctor stands behind you and looks at what you're doing, and then keeps score and all of that kind of stuff. It was believed that because I was able to pass the intelligence, that I had the proper intelligence score when I was in kindergarten, that meant that I would be fine when I was a 12th grader. They didn't recheck my IQ every year. They just kind of assumed that since I had what it took as a kindergartner, that I'd be fine for the rest of my educational experience. So it's still a fairly widely held idea that IQ is a fixed thing. That's a false belief. We can actually modify it fairly easily, 20 points in either direction. If you put a lot of effort into feeding and educating and caring for children and giving them great educational opportunities, you tend to bump the score about 20 points up. And if you put children in dangerous environments, if you don't give them enough food, if you don't have adults devoted to their development, if they're understimulated, if they don't get to go outside and play and learn and all these sorts of things, you can drop IQ points by about 20 points. We've known for a long time that intelligence is you're probably born with a certain range that you can that will manifest during your lifetime, but you can shift how that intelligence manifests through nurture, right? So it's partially nature, but it's largely nurture. And if we want to make the best society that we can have, we definitely need to invest in our children. We need to make sure that all kids have enough to eat, that they have safe environments, that they have solid educations, all of that kind of stuff. All these things will boost everybody's IQ. Okay, so anyways, in 1949, David Wexler, who was actually a student of Charles Spearman at one point, developed a different intelligence test, and this would be the other most commonly used intelligence test today. This would be the Wexler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS. And he believed in G like Spearman did, but he didn't think that the Stanford-Binet test tested enough. He thought that it was too verbal and that it didn't it didn't test what he called performance, right? He set up a verbal and a performance concept to the test. So performance takes into account like how fluently can you answer the questions, like how quickly do you answer the questions? Does it take you a long time or can you do it quickly? He also awarded extra points for complex or innovative answers, right? So it's not just a question of do you get the question right or do you get it wrong, but how elegant is the reasoning behind the answer that you come up with? How do you arrive at the answer? So he starts looking at intelligence very qualitatively, and he looks at it largely in terms of things that are unseen mental processes, not just the measurable verbal responses. So yeah, his test becomes very, very popular. For him, he recognizes, like we all do nowadays, that there's a problem with the concept of an IQ test the way it traditionally was formulated. If I am 10 years old and I'm working at the level of a 12-year-old, then that's very clearly, like, it's easy to say, okay, there's an IQ of 120, that person's above average. But we run into a bigger problem, like, okay, so I am 45 right now. Let's say I take the test at 44. And then I take it again at 46, and I get a difference in my scores. Does that even matter? Right. It would be kind of silly to say, oh, I'm a 44-year-old, but I have the mental age of a 46-year-old, or I'm 45, but I have the mental age of a 39-year-old. It doesn't really matter. Most of the development is done at this point. So one of the things that Wexler did was he was one of the psychologists who detached IQ from mental age. And basically he just says an average intelligence is 100. So we kind of keep that idea, right? 10 out of 10, 100. And then one standard deviation above that is 115, and one standard deviation below that is 85. So he basically says that's the next range, right? So if you're above average, you're between 100 and 115. If you're below average, that'd be 85 to 115. And then he just keeps on like labeling by these standard deviations. And that number for Wexler wasn't even necessarily all rooted in trying to evaluate IQ. It was trying to help him understand his patients back when he was at Bellevue Hospital. He was trying to study people who had different types of behavioral disorders and things like that. And he found that the Stanford Binet test just really didn't give him a very clear picture of his patients. And then later on, 1967, he took his adult test and he modified it and made the Wexler Intelligence Scale for Children. And this is kind of the same concept, but for children. And a lot of times now schools will choose the Wexler Intelligence Scale for Children over the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale. Okay, let's talk about some of the key terms that we use in intelligence testing. The first one is standardization. So if you're taking a standardized test, the concept is no matter where you take it or when you take it in the country, you'll have an identical experience. The rules will be the same. The proctors will follow exactly the same verbal instructions. The clock will be on the same wall. The classroom will be set up the same way. Everybody will get the same test. Everyone's supposed to have an identical experience. When you have taken the ACT, you've probably noticed that your proctors they have a speech that they're supposed to give, and they're supposed to read it to you. They're supposed to say stop at certain points. They're supposed to measure the time. All of those are attempts towards standardization. And if you've taken the ACT, you've probably also noticed that standardization might not actually happen as frequently as we hope it will, that sometimes there is a little bit of a difference between one proctor and another proctor, or one classroom and another classroom. But the goal is to give everybody exactly the same experience, to give the test at exactly the same time, to minimize the ability of people to cheat by sharing the test through their smartphones and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and IQ tests tend to follow what is called a normal curve, or you guys might know it as a bell curve. And the concept there is that you should have the most scores in the center area, the average area of intelligence, and then the high intelligence and the low intelligence should have a lower distribution of scores. So you end up getting a chart like the one that I'm posting now, a graph that basically follows this swoopy little bell-like shape. A fun thing that we often talk about with IQ tests is the Flynn effect. And the Flynn effect is this phenomenon that we've noticed that over time, scores on all standardized tests, but particularly IQ tests, just keep on going up. So when we look at American IQ scores, every generation, the number gets higher. If we look at the ACT, people do better. SAT, people do better. Now, the ACT and the SAT have shifted a lot over time. And we also have shifted in the way that we measure intelligence tests, right? We measure IQ. But at the same time, it does seem to be that year after year, these tests go up. There's some indication now that we're finding IQ tests are leveling off a little bit, but generally speaking, the Flynn effect still tends to be true. And what are the reasons for the Flynn effect? One could be that, wow, we're just getting smarter and smarter. What is more likely is that we're getting better at taking multiple choice tests, that people nowadays take many more standardized tests throughout their lives than they did 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago. So we're just getting good at multiple choice. That could be one of the issues. We're getting good at using Scantrons. Another could be that more and more people are familiar with these types of tests, right? So it might have been that 50 years ago, you would have taken the tests if you were college bound. Now everybody takes the tests and everybody's college bound, right? So more and more people get practice and that kicks up the overall number. Part of it could be we have more of a focus on college prep education than we did 50 years ago. A lot of it could be that we have better nutrition than we did years ago, or that we have better instruction or something like that. But generally speaking, we've seen this trend where scores on standardized tests, particularly on IQ tests, just keep on going up and up and up, and are only now sort of starting to level off. And on the test, it'll probably just say it's the idea that the scores keep going up and up. We don't really know for sure if that's going to continue. It might, but yeah, we've seen it happening. Okay, next up we have reliability, and reliability is the extent to which a test yields consistent scores. So if I take the AP Psych test in 2015, and then I take it again in 2016, will I get the same type of scores? Now, the AP Psych test is pretty interesting for a few reasons. One is we had some minor changes on the test that are supposed to take place for the next few years. Another one, though, is that this year's test is not going to have a multiple choice section on it. So our test might not be that reliable this year because it is a different sort of test. The multiple choice section used to count for 2/3 of the test, and almost everybody does better on the multiple choice section than on the free response section. The free response tends to have a little bit of grade adjustment to respond to the fact that most people don't get, or actually generally maybe it's 1 or 2 people a year get every question right on the psych test. It's rare for anyone to, if you have 8 terms per free response, to get all 16 terms right. So this year might be interesting. It's not really going to fit into the older models for reliability. It still should be a good indicator of what we know and what we don't know, and we can still rank each other against other students. But we might find that there are some significant shifts in the way scoring normally happens this year because of this test. Yeah, but the hope is if you're taking the ACT, that the ACT that you take in the fall should give you the same score roughly as the one that you take in the winter, which should be equally as challenging as the one that you take in the spring. Now, at the same time, we run into a problem if we try to test reliability that way. Like if I were to say, okay, I'm going to give you this test in the fall, and then I'm going to give it to you again in the winter, and then I'm going to give it to you again in the spring. Are we going to find that it's reliable, or are we going to find that every time you take the same test, you do a little bit better on it? The truth is that most of us would do better if we kept on taking the same test. So if we're trying to find reliability, another thing we could do is give you different tests, which is what actually happens, right? So you take one version of the ACT in the fall, you take another version of the ACT in the winter, and you take another version of it in the spring. Now, do your scores go up? Generally, yes, they do. So does that mean that they aren't reliable? Well, the problem here when we're measuring reliability that way is even though they're different tests, you get a little bit better and more efficient at taking the test every time you take it. You also have time to study for the test. You know what you're good at, what you're not good at. You can target those problems, and then your score goes up. So how can you very fairly test reliability? The technique that we tend to use here is called split half reliability. And the idea here is that you have different versions of the same types of questions, and they all have the same level of difficulty. So maybe you have a comma question that is easy, and then you have another comma question that's very easy, and you have maybe a comma question that's very difficult, and you have another comma question that's very difficult, and so on for every type of factor of the test that you're looking at. What you do with split half is you make the first half of the test mirror the second half of the test in terms of its difficulty and the types of questions. And it doesn't really literally have to be the first and the second half. It can be you just have a key that lets you know that question number one is doubled in its difficulty in question 24, and question number 2 is doubled in its difficulty in question 37. At any rate, though, you look at these, you cut the scores in half. You look at these two different sections of the test that are supposed to be duplicates of each other in terms of difficulty, and you see if the same person taking the test at the same time did equally well on one part of the test and the other part of the test, which are designed to be different questions but equal in their content and difficulty. And if you find that the scores are consistent there, then you have achieved perfect split half reliability, right? If the scores in one part of the test and the other part of the test that's designed to be a duplicate of it match up, then you have split half reliability. This tends to be the best way to test the reliability of a standardized test. Okay, and next, what do we have? Validity. So validity is the extent to which a test measures what it claims to measure. So if I am offering people an intelligence test, does it actually measure intelligence? If I'm giving people a college aptitude test, is it actually going to predict their success in college? If I'm giving people an officer's readiness test, is it going to test their ability to be officers? That sort of thing. So the ACT, one question we might have here is, does it actually measure success in college, right? There are kind of two things we could say it measures. One is readiness for college. Do you know how to do college level work? Does it measure that? Well, sort of. Like it shows like that you've got some baseline skills, that you understand the basic rules of grammar, and that you understand how to write an essay, and that you know how to read graphs for science, and that you understand a certain level of high school math. Does it actually predict high school or college success? Not exactly. GPAs used to be a better indicator of college success. but even GPAs now, one of the problems we're running into is a problem with range. So think about it this way. When I was in high school, it would have been possible for me to get into MSU with a 3-point GPA and a 21 ACT. If we look at trying to get into MSU nowadays, I think it's something more like a 28 ACT and a 3.8 GPA, something like that. So if all of the people that you're admitting to college are just about rocking a 4-point and have very high ACT scores, then you have this very limited range of people. So does this now mean that nobody who goes to college fails out? Well, no, it seems like the same amount of people fail out that have always failed out, and it seems like the same amount of people struggle that have always struggled. So we're not necessarily getting that great of predictive validity from the ACT in terms of will people succeed in college. The numbers just don't help us that much. So what does oh, and by the way, what is predictive validity? It's the extent to which a test accurately anticipates future performance on a task, right? So what does the ACT actually measure? It measures your ability to do well on the ACT. It measures how well you know your basic math, how well you know your grammar, how well you can take multiple choice tests. It might also indirectly measure socioeconomic status, which is the thing that we're going to talk about later, in some of the next modules, that there might be some bias built into the test based on what sort of access you've had to the sorts of things that make us successful. Cool. When we're talking about validity, the other kind of validity besides predictive validity is content validity. So this would be the extent to which a test accurately measures the behavior of interest. AP Psychology is supposed to be a good mirror for taking Psych 101 in college. If you do well on the AP Psych test, you should be able to pass Psych 101 in college, no problem. And is that true? Generally speaking, yes. Dartmouth tries to claim that it is not true, and the way they measured this was by taking a bunch of people who had 5s on the AP Psych test, and then when they were freshmen in college, giving them their Psych 101 final on the first day. And basically what they found was that those kids were not very good at passing the Psych 101 final, and Dartmouth uses this as an excuse not to give people credit for their AP Psych scores. Is this fair? Well, let's try this one. Let's take a bunch of students who have taken Psych 101 at Dartmouth, and a year later, let's give them the AP Psych test and see if they do well on it. There are a number of confounding variables here, right? One is the amount of time that's passed since you've taken the test. Another is in college, what tends to happen in Psych 101 is your professor is someone who has studied one area of psychology to a very special degree, right? So, for instance, my first psych teacher was really into clinical psychology. I had another psych teacher who was very into social psychology. I had many who were into developmental psychology. So when those people go and teach Psych 101, they may be covering the whole history of psychology, but it might be what they really care about is social psychology, and you really get into the weeds in social psych, and the other stuff is just sort of like, oh yeah, and then there was this guy named Thorndike, right? So, I think there's a challenge there. I think that we're not necessarily comparing apples to apples. I think that's one of the same things. One of the things we have to deal with that's a confounding variable. Another thing we have to deal with is the amount of time that passes. Another thing would be like how well are people prepped for the testing methods that they're being challenged by. So I think Dartmouth is a little bit off in their claim that they shouldn't count AP Psych tests. I think that's largely a money grab. And the funny thing there is that they want you to take a bunch of APs to show you've taken the most difficult classes, but they haven't actually, they're not going to count any of the advanced credit that you earn because it's not up to Dartmouth standards. I think that is it. If you guys have any questions, just email me, contact me through GroupMe. If you haven't signed up yet, make sure you get on that. And we have covered enough now to do our first free response. So check that out on Moodle, and contact me if you need anything. Check Moodle for when our office hours are going to be if you want to stop by those. And I hope you're doing really well. Stay healthy, and thanks for joining me in the Underground.